it's time for another Buford Pusser, the other story, and today we're going to talk about the Pusser curse. A lot of the members of the Pusser family have died tragic deaths, and we're going to go back 5 generations today, and we're going to start with Atoye Barnes, the most recent to have passed away. Atoye Alexander Barnes was born on December 1st, 1977 and passed away on June 5th of 2024. There are all sorts of rumors about the cause of her death, and I'm not going to take a deep dive into that, only to say that she suffered from her own demons. There is a lot of secrecy among the family and the community itself in Adamsville about the cause of her death, and I don't intend to speculate, just to say what I know, and that is that she aspirated on her own vomit and died at her home, with her body being discovered by one of her sons. With that tragic death behind us, we'll move on to the next. Her mother, Dwana Pusser Garrison. Dwana Pusser Garrison was born on January 9th, 1961 in Chicago, Illinois. Her family moved to Adamsville, and this was her home until the time of her death. She died at her home on March 7th of 2018 of a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Now, like her daughter Atoye, she suffered from many demons. She was going through yet another divorce, as she had been married several times. In the process, she had moved from her mini mansion to a double-wide manufactured home, something that many say she felt was below her standard of living. Due to the divorce, she said to have been losing her health insurance, and she had multiple sclerosis, and it was only getting worse. She had an accident and was charged with a DUI. She had 2 court dates set, one for the divorce, one for the DUI. And just days before her suicide, she took many of the items that she had that had belonged to Buford to the museum and left them there. She told a close friend that she couldn't live this way any longer, and that night she committed suicide. As with Atoye, there are many that didn't want anyone to know that her death was due to a suicide. That was never publicly announced by officials. When members of the local community began to speculate that her death was due to a suicide, other family members tried to squash the rumor. When I addressed it on my Facebook page, I was attacked by family members saying that I was lying, so I produced a copy of her autopsy report. It's unfortunate that the Pusser family wants to hide what seems to be a curse in the family of so many people dying tragically. Next, we'll cover the demise of Helen Pusser, the grandmother that passed away quite some time before Dwana. Be sure and subscribe and hit that bell so that you'll get notifications of new videos when they're released. Helen Pusser was born on September 6th, 1908, and she passed away on January 1st, 1987. She'd been in the hospital the month before, spent 3 weeks there due to a blood clot. She returned home from the hospital on December 24th and passed away about a week later. Now, no cause of death was listed, but one can only imagine that it had a great deal to do with the blood clot that she had suffered from. Now, Helen was active in the community. She was a member of the Church of Christ in Adamsville. She was also a member of the Parent Teachers Association in Adamsville, and she served as a gray lady there, a volunteer at McNairy County General Hospital. At work, she served as secretary of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers Local 729, and she retired from Harwood Manufacturing Company in Adamsville. Helen was quite a figure in Buford's life. She never doubted her son's integrity, his honesty, even though we've now established that the walking tall version of Buford Pusser was not really true. Now, Helen really didn't care for the Walking Tall movies. She would be one of the first ones to point out that they weren't really all that accurate, and she really disliked the way that they often showed Buford on screen. She would say that he never wore blue jeans or any clothing such as that he always dressed nicely in suits and sports jackets. So she didn't care much for the movies in that regard. Plus, she didn't care much for Bo Svensson's portrayal of her son in the movies. Now, in August of 1974, Buford was killed in a tragic single vehicle accident. Helen, however, refused to accept that Buford just died from reckless driving. She also convinced her granddaughter, Dwana, of the same thing. And Helen launched into having a private investigation of her own about his death, even though different law enforcement agencies had deemed that no one else was involved in his death, that it was a simple car accident. But she hired a private investigator named Larry Britt, and Britt took Helen to the cleaners. The only thing is, Helen wasn't spending her money. She was spending Dewana's trust fund that Buford had left her. Over a period of just months, Britt had spent the majority of Dewana's trust fund. Now, Helen allowed this to happen, and even though she didn't die a tragic death, there was a stain that this left on her reputation. There were all kinds of legal proceedings. Some of these legal proceedings involved the fact that Dewana and especially Helen had wanted Buford's body exhumed because Helen thought that Buford had been poisoned, and that was the reason that he had his wreck. At the same time, you had Carl and John fighting against Helen and Dewana in court, not wanting to have the body exhumed for testing. It was a real circus. Much like Helen, Carl Pusser passed away of natural causes. Now, the movies Walking Tall, much like they did with Buford, portrayed him as a different character than what he really was. Now, while it showed him as being a individual that was involved in logging and such, he was actually a sharecropper. He didn't own his own home until all three of his kids were grown. Now, there's been any number of people that I have interviewed that have told me that Carl was a moonshiner by trade later on, and that he eventually went into law enforcement, being chief of police in Adamsville. But there's another falsehood here because everyone believes that when Buford returned from Chicago, Carl got him a job in Adamsville, which that part is true. But the thing is, he didn't succeed Carl as chief of police like that many people say. Carl stepped down in 1957. Buford didn't get there until 1961. The fact is that Buford Surratt was constable and chief of police after Carl, and then Buford stepped in. There's not a whole lot you can believe about the Walking Tall version of things or what W.R. Morris wrote. Pauline Pusser. Now, most of us already know how she died tragically on August 12th, 1967. It was in an ambush allegedly meant for Buford. But there are so many questions, so many clues that were not examined. And now the TBI is investigating her death again. And I applaud them for this. It's difficult to understand how that so many clues, so much evidence, so many people could be ignored in the first investigation. So for that reason, I am fully behind what the TBI is doing now. I think they're doing a great job. But sometime in the near future, we hope to hear what they have found, what they have concluded. But the point is, Pauline died a very tragic death. It was something that didn't have to happen. If not for her death, there would be no Pusser legend because that was the catalyst that spurred the Walking Tall movies and all the books about Pusser that contain a lot of incorrect information. Now, Buford also died a very tragic death, but it was nothing like what we saw in the movie Walking Tall. That was so exaggerated and over the top that it is absolutely unbelievable if you've ever studied the accident report. His death was basically due to too much car, too much speed, and too much alcohol. That was what Trooper Paul Irvin told me the day that I interviewed him. And he also suggested that his accident report that he turned in was rejected several times until he took out Buford's blood alcohol level. Buford Pusser didn't have to die. It was self imposed, like I said. He was traveling way too fast. It appears that he went off the right shoulder, pulled back on the highway, overcorrected, slid into an embankment several hundred feet from where he went off the road, and killed himself. And yet, people look at him as a hero when he actually died as a drunk driver. His blood alcohol content was 0.18. Now, allow me to say up front that there's not a lot of information about the next individual on the Pusser tragedy list. That would be Carl's father, Hugh Pusser. Now, he died on August 30th, 1968, just about the time that Buford was going to be sworn in his last term as sheriff. The odd part of it is, Hugh Pusser died of a self inflicted gunshot wound. The tragedies didn't end with those members of the Pusser family, as we've yet to talk about Mike and Diane. They lost their mother, then they lost their stepfather, and it's odd that the curse caught up with them in a different way. They had no means of support for themselves. Diane would eventually work for Dwana at the Pusser restaurant, and I'm told that she treated Diane just like any other employee. Mike divorced himself from the family because things were so bad, and when you think about it, there was a lot of money that came in life insurance, royalties from the movies, so on. Dwana got it all. She didn't share with Mike and Diane. So there was a certain kind of tragedy there. them feeling left out of everything, especially when you consider that they had a loss as well. So there you have it, folks. A family cursed. So consider all the sources of tragedy here: immaturity, infidelity, poor judgment, drugs, alcohol, greed. It was all here. And one family suffered a great deal from that. And much of it leads directly back to Buford himself. Thanks for being here, and remember, truth has no agenda. See you next time.